and demanded the successful real estate firm we built, our sprawling suburban mansion, and every single cent in our joint investment accounts. My lawyer practically fell out of his chair begging me to fight. Instead, I looked my husband dead in the eye, picked up the pen, and signed it all away without shedding a single tear. All he left me with was the sole custody of our twin children and an old, forgotten commercial property on the edge of a city. He smirked as he walked out of the courtroom, convinced he had completely ruined me and secured his wealthy future. What he didn't realize was that the massive empire he just took over was a meticulously wrapped time bomb of hidden operational debts, and that worthless property he dumped on me held the exclusive, newly approved commercial zoning rights he desperately needed to survive. My name is Evelyn, and at 38 years old, I found myself sitting at a sleek mahogany table, staring at the man I had loved for over a decade. Richard sat across from me, flanked by two high-priced corporate attorneys who looked at me with clinical indifference. Just 3 weeks prior, my entire world had shattered when I discovered a trail of text messages and offshore financial transfers exposing Richard's long-term affair with his 24-year-old marketing assistant. But he wasn't just leaving our marriage, he was staging a hostile takeover. Together, we had spent 12 grueling years building a highly successful luxury real estate firm from the ground up. I had managed the complex operations, the debt structures, and the client relations, while he acted as the public face. Now, his lawyers aggressively made their demands clear. Richard wanted the empire. He wanted our sprawling suburban mansion, the joint investment accounts, and every single liquid asset we owned. He intended to leave me completely stripped of the wealth we had built together, using a prearranged legal trap to corner me. His lead attorney slid a thick stack of divorce papers across the table, the pages catching the harsh fluorescent light of the conference room. Richard leaned back in his leather chair, crossing his legs with a smug, patronizing smirk that made my blood run cold. He genuinely believed that a woman like me would break under the pressure, leaving me entirely at his mercy. My lawyer, David, frantically leaned over and grabbed my arm, his voice a harsh whisper that filled the tense silence of the room. He begged me to stop, pointing out the absolute absurdity of the terms and insisting that we could fight this aggressive asset grab in court for the next 3 years. But I wasn't listening to his warnings. Instead, my eyes were locked onto the embedded financial appendices attached to the back of the corporate restructuring proposal, spreadsheets that Richard had carelessly tossed in just to show off his complete victory. As I scanned the dense columns of numbers, my years of operational oversight allowed me to spot a critical, catastrophic pattern in the company's rolling credit lines that Richard's high-priced lawyers had completely failed to notice. A calm, icy wave of certainty washed over me. I reached into my purse, pulled out my favorite pen, and smoothly signed every single release form, voluntarily giving up my rights to the mansion, the cash accounts, and the real estate firm. All I demanded in return was the sole legal custody of our twin children and the full deed to a neglected, historic brick warehouse situated on the forgotten, industrialized edge of the city. Richard had purchased that rundown property years ago as a useless tax write-off, and he viewed it as an active financial liability. As he watched me sign the final page, he let out a sharp, arrogant laugh, completely convinced that my spirit was broken and that he had successfully ruined my entire future. Before I continue, I want to say how glad I am to have you here. You're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. The transition from a life of extreme luxury to a stark, unpredictable reality happened almost overnight. I quietly packed up my twins' belongings and moved us into a modest, 3-bedroom rental house on the quiet side of town, far away from the elite country club circles we used to dominate. The luxury SUVs were gone, replaced by a reliable used sedan, but for the first time in years, the suffocating tension in my chest had completely vanished. Once the children settled into their new school routine, I drove out to the edge of the city to inspect the only asset I had left, the old, historic brick warehouse. The roof leaked, the windows were boarded up with weathered plywood, and the exterior walls were covered in faded graffiti. To anyone else, it looked like a crumbling pile of debris, but to me, it represented a blank canvas. I spent 3 straight days locked in the county records office, meticulously pulling the city's updated municipal master plans. That was when I uncovered the massive secret Richard had completely overlooked in his rush to rob me. The city council had secretly approved a massive commercial rezoning initiative, designating my exact plot as the sole protected gateway for the city's upcoming multi-million-dollar transit expansion project. While I was quietly uncovering the hidden potential of the historic warehouse, Richard was busy celebrating his apparent victory in our former suburban mansion. He threw lavish dinner parties, paraded his new girlfriend around the city's exclusive country clubs, and basked in the praise of colleagues who congratulated him on successfully cutting his ex-wife out of the lucrative empire. To the outside world, he was the undisputed king of the local luxury real estate market. But inside the corporate offices, a silent, catastrophic storm was already beginning to brew. Richard had always been the charismatic face of the company, but he had absolutely no understanding of the intricate financial scaffolding I had built to keep the business afloat. Within 45 days of my departure, the first of several massive balloon payments on our secondary lines of credit came due. Because I was no longer there to quietly restructure the debt and manage the cash flow, the company's primary accounts were instantly drained to satisfy the predatory lenders. Worse out, the flagship multi-million-dollar commercial plaza development project he had banked his entire financial future on suddenly ground to a screeching halt. The City Planning Commission unexpectedly denied his building permits, citing a critical failure to comply with newly updated municipal easement and public access regulations. The project was completely dead in the water, hemorrhaging hundreds of thousands of dollars in daily holding fees. Richard's high-priced lawyers and consultants scrambled for a solution, but the reality was absolute. Without an immediate corporate miracle to salvage the zoning requirements, the entire real estate empire he had stolen from me was actively tumbling toward total, unmitigated bankruptcy. The panic inside Richard's corner office was palpable as the reality of his situation set in. He spent frantic days huddled with engineering consultants and urban planners, desperately trying to find a legal loophole to bypass the city's strict public access mandates. Finally, a senior zoning engineer laid out a color-coded municipal map on his desk and pointed to a narrow strip of land that bordered the western edge of his stalled multi-million-dollar commercial project. The engineer explained that the project could be fully saved, but only if Richard could immediately acquire that specific parcel to create the mandatory public easement. Relief washed over Richard, and he instantly ordered his team to pull the official property deeds from the county registrar, eager to write a check and bury the problem with cash. But as the clerk pulled up the digital ownership record, the room went entirely cold. The name printed in bold letters on the active deed was mine. The vital piece of land he absolutely required to save his empire was the exact historic warehouse property he had so smugly dumped on me during our divorce. He had mocked me for taking it, believing he had saddled me with a worthless financial liability. Now, the asset he discarded was the only key to his survival. If he couldn't acquire it within 30 days, his primary lenders would officially declare default, foreclosing on his company and seizing the family mansion. The absolute irony of the situation hit him like a physical blow. The brilliant businessman had successfully trapped himself in a prison of his own arrogance, and he was completely at the mercy of the ex-wife he thought he had ruined. The arrogant man who had thrown divorce papers across a kitchen counter was completely gone when Richard walked into my modest, new office. His expensive suit looked rumpled, his face was pale, and he couldn't even meet my eyes as he sat down. He nervously opened his briefcase and slid a contract toward me, offering to buy my historic warehouse property for double its original market value. He tried to frame it as a final act of generosity for the mother of his children, desperately playing the role of the benevolent provider one last time. I didn't even look at the check. Instead, I leaned back, flanked by David and a new team of aggressive commercial real estate attorneys I had hired with the initial transit project funding. I calmly informed Richard that the warehouse was absolutely not for sale. His composure completely shattered. He began to beg, realizing that I held the absolute power to let his entire life collapse into bankruptcy court by the end of the month. I gave him my only counteroffer, a strict, non-negotiable long-term lease agreement for the easement. In exchange for the land rights, I demanded 51% voting control over the real estate firm we had built together, effectively stripping him of his title as majority owner. He stared at the terms in absolute horror, realizing that the quiet wife he had tried to exploit had just outmaneuvered him completely, taking back her empire entirely on her own terms. Richard had no choice but to sign the crushing terms, his hands shaking as he finalized the lease agreement that stripped him of his majority power. But his financial mismanagement ran too deep, even with the months later to cover his personal debts, leaving him entirely broke. He lost our former mansion to the bank, eventually moving into a tiny apartment while working under a boss who didn't care about his past titles. Meanwhile, I used the city's massive transit funding to completely revitalize the historic brick warehouse, turning it into a thriving, high-end commercial hub that now generates millions in passive revenue. I built a beautiful, secure life for my twins, proving to everyone, and most importantly, to myself, that I never needed a corrupt partner to build a lasting legacy. I am finally free, wealthy, and fully in control of my own destiny. Now, I'm deeply curious about all of you who have listened to my journey until the very end. What would you have done if you were standing in my shoes at that divorce table? Would you have signed everything away to play the long game, or would you have fought him right from the start? Let me know how karma deals with arrogance. Make sure to click on the next